Icure Hospitals, Vizag. Now, we have 9 papers here, sir, in this session. Each will last for about 10 minutes with 8 minutes of speech and 2 minutes for questions. We have 9 speakers in total. We should strictly maintain the timings. The first speaker is Dr. Bal Parmeswar Rao. He is online, and I request the chairpersons to take over the program. Host. Thank you, sir.
Suresh, you go ahead.
Okay. So good morning, everybody. And this is a free paper session. This is from 8 o'clock to 9:30. 9 papers are scheduled to be presented in this hour. And to begin with, it will be Dr. Bal Parameswar Rao. And I hope he knows that the time is 8 minutes for presentation, 2 minutes for questions. So
Yes,
he
sir.
can, he can start over now.
How many we have now ready?
9 papers.
9 people are there ready.
I believe, yes, that is what Varaprasad should tell us. Dr.
Yeah,
Varaprasad?
total nine
have
papers are there.
All of them
No,
are
no,
ready?
one has dropped out. One has dropped out.
So
Number
you-
2 has dropped out.
Okay.
Number 2 has dropped out. Swapnil, Dr. Swapnil has dropped out.
Okay. Suresh, maintain a stop clock.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Good morning, respected chairpersons, seniors, and colleagues. Today, I'll be discussing brief points about intraoperative neuromonitoring in spine tumors. So, the history of intraoperative neuromonitoring dates back to times of Sir Wilder Penfield, when he started doing cortical mapping for his epilepsy surgeries. The advantages being to decrease neurological damage, improve outcome, and to identify important neural structures. So coming to spine tumors, we can use intraoperative neuromonitoring for all the lesions such as extradural, intradural, extramedullary, and intramedullary tumors. The main modalities being somatosensory evoked potentials and transcranial motor evoked potentials. So what is the main difference between SSEP and MEP? SSEP is we are trying to identify the sensory input, whereas in motor evoked potentials, we are producing a motor response at the level of the motor cortex and detecting it peripherally. So in SSEP, the main long track along which the sensory pathways are transmitted is the posterior column, whereas in the MEP, the impulses are transmitted along the corticospinal tracts. Coming to SSEP, as we have mentioned, the impulses are produced by electrodes placed peripherally. For upper limbs, it is the median nerve at the wrist, and for lower limbs, it is the posterior tibial nerve near the medial malleolus. The signals are produced as a train of continuous stimuli, and the output is assessed by averaging. So there is definitely a lag period of about 15 to 20 minutes. The alarm signs being a decrease in amplitude of more than 50%, or an increase in latency of more than 10%. The false negative results are high when we use only SSCP. That is why there is the concept of multimodal intraoperative neuromonitoring, where we use SSCP along with MEP. MEP, as I had already discussed, it is the descending corticospinal tract. Recordings are either obtained from the end muscle by electrodes placed in the muscle groups, or directly from the spinal cord, which is called D waves. What is a D wave? In D wave, the electrode is passed, after we do the laminectomy, the electrode is passed epidurally, caudal to our surgical site, so that we measure the impulses directly from the pyramidal tracts. The advantage of D wave being it is less sensitive to halogenated anesthetics such as sevoflurane, and it is not affected by neuromuscular blocking agents, as we are directly taking the impulse from the pyramidal tracts and not from the muscle groups. And it monitors fast fibers. The drawback of D wave is it cannot define laterality. That is, we don't know whether the right side tracks have been involved or the left side tracks have been involved. And another disadvantage is we cannot use D wave for lesions below D12 or conus tumors, as it is mainly the nerve roots which are present there. So the difference between SSCP and MEP is in SSCP, there we can it is a continuous monitoring system. whereas MEP is a triggered impulse. We give the impulse, we immediately measure see the waves and assess. So we don't get a continuous monitoring with MEP. In SSCP, there is a lag period, whereas in MEP, there is no lag period. And SSCP is not affected by anesthetic drugs such as neuromuscular blocking agents or inhalational anesthetics, whereas MEP is affected. That is why when we are using MEP, it is better to go for a total intravenous anesthesia with propofol. So what do we do when there is a signal deterioration? Simple measures such as temporarily to stop the surgery to decrease the retraction, irrigating with warm saline, which dilutes accumulated potassium and clears blood products and metabolites, and also increasing mid arterial pressure, which enhances the local perfusion. I'll just present one of my case. This was a 40-year male who presented with upper limb weakness and features of myelopathy. MRI, as we have seen, is showing a well-enhancing lesion in the cervical cord, intramedullary lesion with polar cyst. The spot diagnosis of intramedullary lesion like ependymoma. So this was the case for the lower limbs. We have done the SSCP, the posterior tibial nerve, and muscle groups for which we are assessing was the abductor hallucis, tibialis anterior, and the vastus lateralis in the lower limb. And in the upper limb, it is the abductor pollicis brevis, brachioradialis, and deltoid muscles. The recording electrodes for the MEP are placed in the scalp. It is somewhat similar to the EEG 1010 system. These are corkscrew electrodes which can be easily inserted into the scalp. And even for the SSCP, the recording electrodes are placed in the scalp. I'll just show the surgical video briefly. This was the durotomy, followed by a routine midline myelotomy.
And we can say that the patients with pelvis fractures have a more stringent injuries, and simple measures like wearing helmet and not driving while run will prevent.
The tumor, as it was an ependymoma, a clear plane could be developed, and tumor could be slowly removed. However, as we were removing the tumor, at this point during the surgery, we noticed that the MEP started falling. That was probably because of the retraction by the tumor bulk itself. That was when I started debulking the tumor.
To predict the possibility of a facial palsy. The third.
And with using a CUSA, I slowly debulked the tumor when I noticed that the MEP started regaining. So in piecemeal, I had to remove the tumor. Finally, this was after the tumor excision and a clear bed was seen. So as I had already mentioned, there was not much change in the SSCPs during the surgery for either the upper or lower limbs. However, as you can see, the transcranial motor evoked potentials, the waves at durotomy have definitely decreased in amplitude during tumor excision. That was when I started debulking the tumor and removing it piecemeal. At the end of surgery, we can see that the MEPs have started regaining. That was somewhat a positive sign that I had not completely injured the tracts. And this was the patient at 10 days post-op. He was walking comfortably. However, there was some loss of posterior column sensations. So what do we require for introducing intraoperative neuromonitoring into our OT? It is a trained technician or neuroanesthetist, a definite increase in OT time, and additional cost. If you go for the Medtronic complete system, it costs around 35 lakhs, 35 to 40 lakhs. So it is definitely a huge cost. So is it really worth taking this such a cost and increasing our OT time as well as the money? So I'm just presenting one single paper which was presented in published in 2020 Global Spine Journal. It was a sort of meta-analysis. They reviewed many studies and it has shown that definitely there is an increase in sensitivity to detect the neurological injury during surgery of almost 80 to 90%, and some studies have even showed 100% ability to detect a neurological injury. And coming to the cost benefit analysis, though the intraoperative cost has definitely increased by the use of intraoperative neuro monitoring, the overall cost for the patient has decreased as the cost for neuro rehabilitation has significantly decreased because we are avoiding a post-operative deficit such as paraplegia. So my final word being that as in neurosurgery, we are moving towards better outcome and trying to minimize complications. Introducing intraoperative neuromonitoring into the OT system, OT setup is worth the effort. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, that is an excellent presentation, Dr. Balparameswar Rao. And how often do you use it for extradural surgeries?
Like when there is foraminal tumors, which are dumbbell-shaped tumors, where we are more likely to injure the cord, especially cervical dumbbell-shaped tumors, sir. When there is a lot of retraction, we need to go intradural as well as extradural. In such cases, it is better to use intraoperative monitoring.
Yeah, any questions from the audience?
It's a very good presentation.
Thank you.
Actually, I believe for us, 90% of the spinal cord tumors may not require this option. Whenever there is a the margin between the spinal cord and the tumor is not very clearly we can't make it out. Then only this technique may be useful. That's a neuromonitoring.
Yes.
And with the available microscopes, I think definitely with available high-end microscopes, definitely it will be a very good option. And slowly, the use of this neuromonitoring is mainly for consumers' purpose. That's what I believe. Thank you. It's a good paper, good effort.
Nice presentation, Balparameswar Rao.
Thank you, sir.
I'm Dr. Vijay Sagar, really complimenting you.
Thank
Good.
you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Can we go to the next presenter?
Next presenter is Dr. Mohan Murali. Dr. Swapnil is absent.
Okay, Dr. Mohan Murali, please
Yes, sir.
introduce
Good
yourself
morning,
before you go on for presenting your paper.
Yes, sir. Good morning, sir. Sir, my name is Dr. Murali, sir. I'm a senior resident in Department of Neurosurgery, SWIMS Tirupati, sir. I'm presenting a case series of cervical disc arthroplasty, which was done in our institute, and my guides being Dr. BCM Prasad, sir, and Dr. VV Ramesh Chandra, sir. Can I proceed, sir?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Sir, good morning. Good morning, everyone, sir. Coming to the introduction, sir, cervical spondylosis, which was an inevitable consequence of aging, which was seen in aging population. Nearly after 40 years of age, nearly almost 60% of the population has a radiographic evidence of cervical spine degeneration, and it was by the age of 65 years, 95% of the men and 70% of the women have at least one degenerative changes on which was seen on radiographs. The elimination of the motion at the
You can keep in a slideshow mode. It will be viewed better. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry for the interruption.
Yes. So the elimination of motion at the physiological functional spinal unit has been the mainstay of treatment since 1960s. So in the past several decades, ACDF has been applied to multiple cervical disorders, including cervical spondylotic myelopathy, radiculopathy, and cervical ossification of posterior longitudinal ligament. The solid bony fusion in fusion procedures can change the range of motion and the mechanical load of the adjacent segments. Hillebrand et al. In 1999 raised significant concerns regarding the new degenerative changes at the adjacent levels. So from then onward, cervical disc arthroplasty became a better alternative to fusion after anterior neural decompression. In the past several decades, ACDF has been applied to multiple cervical disorders. Sorry. It helps in preserving the cervical disc arthroplasty. It helps in preserving the range of motion at the operated level. It helps in the reduction of the stress-related changes at the adjacent disc segments. And it can also result in some of the complications like disc erosion and toxicity regarding the prosthesis, and the issue of biocompatibility, heterotopic ossification, and implant migration or implant subsidence. The cervical sagittal balance, which plays an important role in transmitting the load of the head and maintaining the global spinal balance. The importance of cervical sagittal parameters in cervical disc arthroplasty is rarely noted. The criteria for adoption for the cervical disc replacement reduces the incidence of adjacent level degeneration compared with the fusion procedures, equivalent or improved effectiveness in terms of lasting relief of signs and symptoms, long-term durability and ease of implantation, and the complication rate that is no higher than that of the ACDF until additional outcome benefits are proven that might overweigh the any added risk, and the acceptable cost. These become the criteria for the adoption. And based upon the implant design considerations, there are many models for the implant were proposed. It was designed based upon the articulation kinematics and the materials used, and the articulation method, and the footplate geometry and dimensions, and attachment to the bone. This was the paper published in 2005 based upon the available various disc processes available. The aims and objectives of the study: to study the clinical outcomes of patients following cervical disc arthroplasty based upon the preoperative and postoperative evaluation of the visual unlike scale and the neck disability index, and to study the radiological outcomes of patients following cervical disc arthroplasty based upon the range of motion and the disc height. A retrospective study of the patients who underwent cervical disc arthroplasty in the Department of Neurosurgery, SWIMS Tirupati, from January 2013 till November 2020. The data was collected from the hospital records, and the essential imaging data from the radiology database was collected. All the patients were subjected to radiological investigations, including the X-rays and the X-rays preoperatively and postoperatively. And the visual analog score and the neck disability index, disc space height, and range of motion were measured preoperatively and postoperatively. Patients with symptomatic cervical disc prolapse not improving on 6 months of conservative management were included. Between the age group of 18 to 60 years, patients were included, and the only single level disc space involvement was included, sir. No previous surgery at the involved levels. Exclusion criteria: patients who are medically unfit for surgery, and with patients with traumatic subluxation or any conditions, generalized conditions like osteoporosis, osteomalacia, and myelomalacia cord changes, presence of osteophytes, and the patients who are not given consent for surgery were all excluded. This is the visual analog scale, and this is the neck disability index measurement, sir. And these are all the procedure pics and intraoperative pics, sir. The positioning of the patient, and this is the these are all the various instruments used in the cervical disc arthroplasty, and this is the setup which was placed. And these are the intraoperative radiographs. And this is the final picture, which was showing disc processes, sir. And this is the intraoperative fluoroscopy imaging, sir. And we can see the complete obliteration and during the disc. And this is the Prestige LP type of disc processes. Almost in every case, almost in all of the cases, we have used it, sir. And this is the final intraoperative picture after disc replacement, sir. And these are the images. In every case, we measure the disc space heights, sir, in using intraoperative, using preoperative CT images and X-ray images, sir. And we can see clearly the disc height improving from preoperative to postoperative imaging, sir. In almost in every case, at every level, we measure the disc space, sir. And these are all the cervical lordotic angles we measure, which is drawn from the inferior border of the C2 vertebra to the inferior border of the C7 vertebra, sir. In both in the preoperative and postoperative, in flexion and extension, we measure the angles and record, sir. Coming to the results, sir, demographic data, total of 40 patients were operated, sir, out of them 14 being the females and 10 and 26 being the males, sir. And the most common age group is around 40 to 30 to 40, 30 to 40 age group, sir. And the most common disc level affected and we operated on is at the C5, C6 level, sir. Nearly 58% of the cases were done at C5 to C6, sir. Next common being C6 to C7, sir. And the majority of the patients presented with neck pain and paresthesia, sir, and 13 of the patients were presented with weakness complaints, sir. And the disc average mean height of the disc height was 0.56 centimeters in the preoperative period, and it was 0.9 centimeters in the postoperative period, sir. And the preoperative angle in flexion and extension is well preserved, sir. Both in when compared to preoperatively, it is 16.15 degrees in preoperative and 16.69 degrees in postoperative. It's average mean angle, sir. And in postoperative extension also, the angle is well preserved, sir. And the visual analog scale, there is a good improvement in the visual analog scale when compared to the preoperative scale. So the average mean is 7 in the preoperative period, and it was 2.5 to 3 in the postoperative period, sir. And the neck disability index, there was a significant variation, sir. And preoperative, it was 59.81, and it is 12.9 in postoperative period, sir. A Prestige LP processes was used in all cases, sir. The patients was followed up for an average of 24 months, sir. The most common level effect is C5 to C6, and followed by C6, C7, and C3, C4, sir. The mean amount of surgical bleeding and surgical time was 76 ml per case, and 1 or 2 minutes, sir, roughly approximately. And the complications we have seen is in adjacent segment degeneration was seen in 5% of the cases, sir, and in heterotopic ossification is seen in 4 cases, sir. Coming to the discussion, sir, in a large institutional review, Lee et al. Found similar rates of adjacent segment degeneration at a follow-up, regardless of whether patients underwent either ACDF, disc replacement, or any posterior foraminectomy. It shows that the post-op, Nunley et al. Later showed that the postoperative adjacent segment degeneration occurred in about 15% of the patients, and preoperative osteopenia and lumbar disc degeneration were all the significant risk factors when studied for the risk factors for adjacent segment degeneration. And in later Gornet et al., he found that the patients treated with the Prestige LP disc obtained significantly improved pain and disability outcomes at 24 months of follow-ups. And adjacent segment degeneration was associated with cervical sagittal alignments. In our study, it was a radiological. The cases we observed was radiological, but clinically the patients were having no complaints on 24 months of follow-up. Our results were consistent with those in the previous meta-analysis by Zhang et al. And he found that the postoperative degree of cervical lordosis was significantly lower in patients who underwent anterior cervical spine surgery and developed ASD compared with those who did not develop ASD by the last follow-ups. Based on our findings and those of the previous studies, we believe that it is important to maintain the normal cervical alignment after cervical disc replacement. So I'll conclude my paper, sir, with cervical disc arthroplasty has become a viable alternative in the management of cervical disc degenerative disease, and the less incidence of anterior segmental anterior level degeneration and preserved range of motion are the advantages associated with this procedure, sir. But the natural process of aging should also be considered when reporting for the adjacent segment disease. However, it requires a careful patient selection and close follow-up for the better clinical results, sir. And these are my references, sir.
It's a good presentation, Doctor.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
It's a well-known fact that adjacent disease incidence will be less, and the range of motion will be very good in the
Yes.
Cervical disc arthroplasty. It's a well-known
Yes.
fact. Cost is the
Yes.
only prohibitively
Yes,
high. Cost is the only
Yes.
problem.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
We should come out with some Indian processes which can have a good biomechanical qualities as well as less cost. Apart from
Yes.
that, thing is we can criticize this surgical technique and the outcomes. Thank you. It's a
Yes.
good presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Any other comments?
Suresh, please unmute. Suresh, you have to please.
Brother Suresh.
Yeah. No, you have to unmute.
Suresh. Okay. Let me welcome. Next case, thank you, Dr. Mohan Murli. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
And next case, a rare case of dorsal cord extradural cavernous hemangioma by Dr. Brijesh Kumar from RMC Kakinada. Dr. Brijesh Kumar. Is he available online?
Huh? No, he is not available. Yeah, he is there. Okay, thank you.
Dr. Brijesh Kumar, keep slideshow. We are able to see your slide. That's good. Yeah. Please unmute your audio.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, audible.
Sir,
Please
sir,
be
good-
loud.
Sir, good morning. Myself, Brijesh Kumar Mishra, sir, a neurosurgery PG from GGH Kakinada, sir. I am presenting the case of rare case of dorsal cord cavernous hemangioma, sir. That introduction part, cavernous hemangioma usually seen in the intercranial structure, but
Hello.
Sir, sorry, sir. Sorry for interruption, sir. Sir, introduction part, sir. Cavernous hemangioma are usually seen in the intracranial structure, but rarely found in the spinal cord and extremely rare in the extradural location. Spinal cavernous hemangioma have incidence of 0.22 cases per million per year, accounting for 5 to 12% of spinal vascular lesion. 51% of which are extradural. Most of them are being secondary extension to vertebral lesion. And pure spinal epidural cavernous hemangioma are uncommon, accounting for only 4% of all spinal lesions. And about the patient history and examination, a 50-year-old male presented with the paresthesia in the lower limbs and abdomen for the 18 month, followed by numbness of all modalities from the level of nipple with a peeling of the girdle-like constriction at the level of nipple. 3 months later, the patient developed gradually progressive descending spastic paralysis, which rendered him bedridden. There is no history of trauma, pain, tenderness over spine, loss of weight, loss of appetite, bladder bowel disturbances. He has no any neurocutaneous marker also, sir. On examination, he has grade 4 by 5 modified Ashworth spastic paralysis with involuntary flexor spasm of both the lower limbs, exaggerated bilateral ankle and knee jerks, and there is a sensory impairment of, sir. There was a sensory impairment or modalities below the T6 level. Routine blood investigation, cardiac and pulmonary status are within normal limits. This is the MRI showing the cavernous hemangioma to T4 to T7 parts. After history and examination, we have done surgery for that patient, and patient underwent T4 to T7 laminectomy and excision of the lesion. Intraoperatively, after the removal of lamina, the mass was identified in the epidural space above the dura, extending into the right lateral recess. It was reddish in color, firm and highly vascular. The lesion was initially devascularized and peeled off the dura in toto. This is the picture showing that tumor part we are removing from that. After surgery, patient has a symptomatic improvement in the immediate post-op period with improvement in the sensation and spasticity. At the time of discharge, he was able to walk with the help of sticks. And on histopathological examination, showed the numerous dilated thin-walled vascular channel lined by the endothelial cells and filled with the RBC. Features are consistent with that cavernous hemangioma. This is a slide picture showing that vascular channel lined by endothelium and filled with RBCs. Immediate post-op MRI was also done, which revealed an irregular heterogeneous T2 hypertensive collection at the laminectomy site and extending into anterior epidural space, causing long segment effacement of the thecal sac, compression with the anterior displacement cord and long segment cord edema. This is a most probably post-operative hematoma or post-operative collection is there. This is a picture showing post-op scan of that patient. Now discussion part. Cavernous hemangioma is also also called as cavernous angioma, cavernoma, and brain cerebral cavernous malformations. It is a type of blood vessel malformation in hemangioma, which is a collection of dilated blood vessel only as a lesion. Cavernous hemangioma occur throughout the central nervous system in the rough proportion to volume of various compartment, just like 80% in the supratentorial, 50% in the brainstem and basal ganglia region, and 5% in the spinal cord region. Cavernous malformation are two types basically, spontaneous and familial. The spontaneous form occurs as an isolated event, with the patient most commonly having a single lesion. In contrast, the familial form, it is characterized by multiple lesions and an autosomal dominant mode of inheritance. In the spine, cavernous hemangioma account for 5 to 12% of the all spinal vascular anomalies, and they usually arise within the vertebral bodies, with the occasional extension into the extradural spaces. Extraosseous extradural means pure spinal hemangioma are relatively uncommon and differ radiologically from their cranial counterparts and may be difficult to diagnose pre-operatively. Hillman and Banky reported an incidence of 0.22% to 22 cases per million per year. Although pure hemangioma are supposedly rarer, but less than 100 cases have been reported in the literature till date, since Globus and Doche first described this entity in 1929. In 2003, 54 cases of pure spinal epidural cavernous hemangioma were reported in the review, and by 2006, 26 more has been added accordingly to review by Hatiboglu and et al. That dated back till 1929. Since then, 9 more cases were reported by Jong et al., 14 by Lee et al., and 33 other according to Khatrabari et al., including their reported series in 9 cases, taking to total above 100 cases only. And epidural cavernous hemangioma is most commonly found in the men, and with the ratio of male to female ratio 2:1, and mostly seen in the age of 40 years. These are references, sir. For that, we have taken data for various cases, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Brijesh.
Thanks.
Thank you for your presentation. Any comments? One point I wanted to just mention at the outset.
Sir,
If the cavernous hemangioma is involving one side pedicle and only one side of the body and compressing the spinal cord from the one side, you can have unilateral exposure and excise the lesion carefully and fix it, stabilize it unilaterally also. I have done such good cases, around 8 to 10 such cases. Unilateral exposure only, other side even muscles also we won't cut.
sir.
Lateral extracavitary approach or paraspinal approaches we adopt.
Sir.
And fix the spinal cord with the pedicle screws, one above and one below the level of involvement, and unilateral approach.
Sir.
Thank you. Dr. Suresh, please.
Yeah, in a purely extradural cavernous hemangioma, which is not involving the vertebral body, the most important thing is complete excision of the lesion. You leave a portion of the tumor, it is either going to bleed or it is going to recur in some circumstances.
Sir.
Okay, in last 12-13 years, I have had the opportunity to operate on some 3 cases, out of which one was a recurrent tumor, operated elsewhere, and then we would have to re-explore. And some of the cavernous hemangiomas have their extensions into the foramina. So you would have to chase it along with the nerve root into the foramina and look into it and bring it out. Generally, a benign lesion, you should be more aggressive in your exposure as well as excision. However, like Dr. Ramanmurthy sir said, if a vertebral body is also involved along with an epidural component, then I suppose you would have to be wary of the bleeding that it can cause during the surgery. I'm sure Ramanmurthy sir would have his own set of experience with the bleeding that that one can encounter in the during the surgery. You have intraoperative phenol injections, sir, or you embolize the patients before you get them onto table?
Actually, in our setup, I have no embolization facility, but phenol I never used, but I did encounter a lot of bleeding, and it troubled me a lot in the beginning days. But later, with the experience, usually I never start dissecting the tumor. I never start removing the tumor in the beginning. I dissect all around and start from the, as you said, from the extraforaminal portion, I start and go to the center. Then I have encountered less bleeding because the supply comes through the foramen most of the time. So first reach out to the extraforaminal area, remove the facets liberally, because anyway you are prepared to fix it, stabilize it with screws and rods. So remove the facets liberally and go to the extraforaminal area first and start from there and dissect it, so that you have clear line of cleavage, and you can definitely control the bleeding very well. That's what I feel. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We can move on to the next speaker, please. Yeah, Dr. Varaprasad, can you help us with the next speaker?
Next speaker will be Jagdish Reddy. Dr. Jagdish Reddy.
Yeah, you are there, Dr. Jagdish?
Yeah, he's there.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Jagdish. Please introduce yourself and go on with the presentation.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, everybody. I am Dr. Jagdish from RMC Kakinada, Neurosurgery final year PG, sir. My mentor is Dr. M. Premjeet Dey. Today, I am going to present data about intradural extramedullary tumors. Intradural extramedullary tumors are not uncommon central nervous system tumors that are found only in 0.3 out of 1 lakh patients each year. The most common intradural extramedullary tumors are derived from sheath cells covering the spinal nerve roots or the meningeal cells located along the spinal cord surface. The most common are the schwannomas and neurofibromas, the nerve sheath tumors, and followed by meningiomas. Myxopapillary ependymomas are extramedullary tumors arising from the conus medullaris and phylum terminalis. Patients with intradural extramedullary tumors often present with symptoms of spinal cord compression. Local or radicular pain is the most common presenting symptom and had the highest incidence in tumors located in the region of lumbar spine. Pain is followed by motor deficits, sensory loss, and last but not the least is the sphincter dysfunction. Magnetic resonance imaging is the investigation of choice for diagnosis of intradural extramedullary tumors. Surgical excision is the best treatment modality in almost all patients with symptomatic intradural extramedullary disease. Gamma knife is reserved for cases not fit for surgery. The objective of our study is to determine the outcome of surgical patients with intradural extramedullary spinal cord tumors. This is a retrospective study of 15 surgical patients who underwent surgery for intradural extramedullary tumors between January 2016 and July 2020. The parameters recorded were patients' demographics, symptoms, tumor characteristics, postoperative follow-up, and surgical outcomes. Patient records were carefully reviewed and surgical outcomes were scored strictly according to the modified criteria of Odom et al. In our study, there were 8 men and 7 women. The mean age was 42 years. Range of age was between 25 to 60 years. Overall, men and women presented at the same age at 42.5 years for men and 42.14 years for women. There were 3 primary tumor types: schwannoma 6 cases, neurofibroma 5 cases, and meningioma 4 cases. Schwannomas were noted to be more common in men, meningiomas more common in women, and neurofibromas are distributed more in women than men. Tumor locations varied between the 3 tumor subtypes in predictable fashion. Schwannomas and neurofibromas were distributed among the cervical and lumbar region, and meningiomas are common in the thoracic region. No patient had multiple intradural extramedullary tumors. These are few MRI images of the patients we operated, sir. A case of cervical intradural extramedullary tumor at a C2 level. This is a dorsal meningioma, sir, anteriorly located. The distribution of tumors by histological type and patient gender in this series were schwannomas were seen only in men, neurofibromas are equally distributed, and meningiomas are seen only in women in our series. And the tumor incidence by age group was schwannomas were seen in age group of less than 40 and 40 to 60 years. Neurofibromas 40 to less than 40 years we have done operated on 3 cases, and 40 to 60 years on 2 cases. Sir. Meningiomas are equally distributed among less than 40 and 40 to 60 years. We didn't have a case above 40 years age group, above 60 years age group. Tumor incidence by anatomic location. Schwannomas were seen in the cervical and lumbar region. Neurofibromas are distributed in all the 3 spinal columns, cervical, thoracic, and lumbar region. Meningiomas were seen only in the thoracic region, sir. The Adams criteria, which states that it is excellent when all preoperative symptoms are relieved, abnormal findings improved, and good when minimal persistence of preoperative symptoms, abnormal findings unchanged or improved. Fair, there is definite relief of some preoperative symptoms, other symptoms unchanged or slightly improved. Poor, symptoms and signs unchanged or exacerbated. In our series, we had excellent outcomes, sir. All the preoperative symptoms were relieved for the patient in the first month of follow-up, and by 6 months they were at the 6-month follow-up also, all the patients were symptom-free. There was no case of recurrence. To conclude, spinal cord tumors are uncommon cause of back pain, cervical pain, myelopathy, and sphincter dysfunction. Preoperative diagnosis on MRI, detailed clinical assessment, and accurate surgical plan is always associated with excellent outcome. All the patients with diagnosis of intradural extramedullary tumor can be operated by performing a laminectomy with excision of tumor through posterior approach alone, irrespective of location and position of the tumor. Surgical outcome is excellent for intradural extramedullary tumors with minimal residual symptoms. These are my references, sir. Thank you.
Hello. Chapandi.
Thank you, doctor. But in your conclusion, what did you say? Cervical tumors are uncommon is myelopathy or cervical pain or sphincter dysfunction.
Sir.
Spinal cord malfunction, myelopathy is common in spinal cord tumors. I couldn't understand this statement. Spinal cord tumors are uncommon cause of back pain, cervical pain, myelopathy.
It is not very common, sir, compared to other disc diseases and degenerative diseases. The spinal cord tumors are not very common.
Okay, in general, you mean to say the myelopathy causes, if you list out the spinal cord tumors causing myelopathy is there. That means you mean to say like that. Okay.
Yes, yes, sir.
It appears like a blanket statement. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I would like to make a small comment here.
Sure.
When I was working at SWIMS Tirupati, somehow we felt that spinal tumors, especially intradural extramedullaries, are endemic to that region. I'm sure Dr. Ramanamurthy sir will have a word or two here. He would have encountered, if it is endemic to Tirupati area, it must be in the place where he is working as well. So he would have had the phenomenal numbers, means much more than what we encountered in residency at Nizams or places elsewhere.
Sure.
Ramanamurthy sir, I'm sure you would have had encountered, at least I believe that the number of cases there in and around that region are phenomenal.
On an average, we operate, I believe it's 4 or 5 cases a month. Spinal cord tumors. Intradural extramedullary, mainly. Intradural extramedullary.
That is extraordinary. Because
it's a good number. 4 or 5 cases I operate every month.
Thank you. So the next presenter is Dr. Rajesh Pati.
Yes, sir.
Good
morning, all.
Pardon,
sir?
Please introduce yourself.
Yes, yes. Sir, good morning, all the faculty. My name is Dr. Rajesh. I'm doing my I'm doing my residency in Visakhapatnam Andhra Medical College, Neurosurgery, sir. My topic for paper presentation today is practical challenges and outcome of patients who are admitted as unknowns with head injury in our centers. So many of the patients are admitted in the hospital as destitutes or unknowns and who are having met with an road traffic accidents. What happens to these patients after admission is not much studied in the literature. And with the ever increasing number of road traffic accidents, there are significant number of such patients are on the rise, and these can be studied. So this was a retrospective as well as a prospective study conducted in our department. We have taken case records of 85 patients who were admitted as unknowns or destitutes with head injury from April 2017 to December 2019. So the mode of presentation, the demographic profile, the CT findings, hospital codes, and the outcomes were analyzed. So among the study, 69 were male and 16 were female. And coming to the age distribution, majority of the patients, that is 42 patients, that is 49%, were between the age group of 41 to 60 years. This is a depiction of the age group, and the majority of the patients, as we can see, are between the age group of 41 to 60, which includes 42 patients. Coming to the mode of injury, road traffic accident was the most common mode of injury in 50 patients, and the mechanism was not known. That is, the patients were lying on the roadside in 35 cases, and among these 35 cases, 3 patients have regained their consciousness, and they have told that their mode of injury was assault. Coming to the GCS, presentation at admission. The patients with GCS of less than 4 were 34, that is 40%, and patients with GCS score of 5 to 8 were 42%. They were 42 patients, that is 49%, and patients with greater than 9 were around only 9 patients. That is, it implies to say that majority of the patients were of poor prognosis, and their outcome is also comparatively poor. So what is the duration of being unknown? That is, patient at the time of admission, followed by whether he remained unknown till death, or whether he was unknown till discharge, or whether what is it concerned duration of the concerned person being as unknown. So majority of the patients, that is 29 patients, were identified or within 1 to 5 hours, and within 1 day they were identified in 8 patients, and it took few days in 11 patients. And in a few patients, that is 32, they remained unknown till death. CD findings in our study, acute subdural hematoma was the major finding in 36% of cases, which was followed by compound fractures in 28 cases, and we had contusions in 23 cases and subarachnoid hemorrhage in 22 cases. So on assessing the patients, they had associated injuries also. Limb injuries was the most common in 21 cases, followed by facial injuries, which was seen in 11 cases. Chest injury was seen in 3 patients, and spinal injury was seen in 1 case. In the study, 52 patients among the 85 identity was established, and in 33 cases it was not established. And among the patients in whom identity was established, 36 was done with the help of relatives, and 10 were with the help of hospital administration, and 6 were identified with the basis of identity card. And the outcome in case of identified group, that is 52, 33 were alive and 19 were dead. And among the unidentified group, 3 were alive and 30 were dead. So coming to the management, we had conservatively managed 69 patients, and we have operated in 16 patients. So coming to the outcome in these two groups, in case of conservative group, 30 were alive and 39 had expired. And in case of operative group, among the 16 operated cases, 6 are alive and dead were 10. And the type of operation was mainly decompressive craniectomy, which was done in 10 cases. Coming to the outcome, this is general outcome. There is a total of 85 patients, among which 36 are alive and 49 are dead. And among the alive patients, 22 were discharged to home. 11 patients went on LAMA or DAMA, and 3 patients absconded. So what are the practical challenges of this concerned situation is, we could make the patient conscious, but owing majority of the patients were from other states like Bihar or Orissa, in which there was a lot of language difficulties, as well as there was impaired comprehension. That is, like, patient was telling his name, but on probing and asking for what is his location or what is his address, he was not able to, I mean, there was some sort of difficulty. So identity could not be revealed. And in majority of unknown patients, they were not able to take care of themselves. And so it basically depends upon the hospital staff commitments. So feeding as well as attending to the needs of these unknown patients was difficult, and it was dependent upon the commitment of the individual caregiver. That is, whoever is taking it. It depends upon their commitment, whether they are interested in taking care of these unknown patients or not. And in this case, in view of 3 patients have improved, but they have died of malnutrition, as there were no proper caregiver. What are the overcomings which are suggested are, like, government should have more inclination in tracing this identity of these unknown patients by means of these paper cuttings or pamphlets, as well as use of print and electronic media. And there were patients in our study who had improved, but we had asked for this Prema Samajam as well as other voluntary organizations to come forward, but they were not willing. In view of this COVID pandemic, they were not willing to take the patients. And third point is the commitment of the care from the caregivers end is needed, so as to improve the outcome of these patients. And improvement of the police department as well as hospital administration in tracing the identity. And NGOs as well as social workers have to come forward in improvement, and after the patients are ambulant, and so as to take care of these patients subsequently. So in conclusion, in spite of adequate medical and surgical care the outcome of these unknown head injury patients is poorer in compared to other patients, and their management is fraught with challenges. They need special care, in which the staff should have the commitment, as well as the hospital must have economic resources, as well as we have to have a good network of social workers. And finally, the existing system needs to be strengthened in identifying the victims. Thank you, sir. I would like to conclude. Any remarks or?
It's a good paper. Thank you.
Yes.
Any individual denied of his life because of lack of identity, social identity, is
No.
not correct. It's
No,
a
sir.
really heart-touching paper.
Yes, sir.
Hello, is it audible?
Yes, sir. It's
Yeah, we are
audible.
audible.
It's a really heart-touching paper. And in private practice, we have least experience on attending the destitutes. So in government hospital, really are doing a good job by attending on these destitutes. It's appreciable effort. Thank you, doctor.
Thank you.
Good. And we have a communication from Dr. Varaprasad saying that one presenter, Dr. Premchand, is available right now to present his paper. So we are ready to take that paper also. The paper name is a rare series of spinal arachnoid syndrome. Our institutional experience from NRI Medical College, Vijayawada. Dr. Premchand.
Yes, sir.
Is
I'm
available?
available, sir.
Premchand is online.
Yes, sir.
Please go ahead.
Sir, good morning, sir. Good morning, everyone.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Premchand. You introduce yourself before you
Yes, sir.
go on
Yes,
with
sir.
the
My
presentation.
Go ahead,
good morning,
Premchand, it's
everyone.
audible and visible.
Yes, sir.
Make it
Is
screen, full screen. Slideshow.
yes, sir. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Premchand Salmuri, second year postgraduate student from Department of Neurosurgery, NRM Medical College. And my title for the platform presentation is a case series of spinal arachnoid cyst, our institutional experience, under guidance of our HOD, Dr. Nageswara Garu, and my guide, Dr. Amit Kumar Garu, and our assistant professor, V. Kiran sir. As an introduction, spinal arachnoid cysts are rare lesions accounting for only 1% of all primary tumors. They can occur in extradural, intradural, or intramedullary locations. This is a graphical depiction showing various locations of the lesion. And spinal extradural arachnoid cysts are a rare cause of spinal cord compression, usually solitary, and typical location is posterior to spinal cord. And extradural cysts have a pedicle in communication with the subarachnoid space and contain CSF. If they enlarge, they usually present with progressive signs and symptoms of spinal cord compression. Other spinal extradural spinal cysts include synovial cysts, cysts of ligamentum flavum, discal cysts, and parasitic cysts. Intradural arachnoid cysts are less common than extradural arachnoid cysts, unlike cerebral arachnoid cysts. So here we describe 7 cases of spinal arachnoid cysts, sir, and data was taken retrospectively in the study between 2013 to 2018, sir. So case 1, a 14-year-old boy presented with progressive weakness of both lower limbs since 40 days. On examination, there is spastic paralysis and power is 4/5 in both lower limbs, no sensory or autonomic disturbances. And deep tenon reflex are exaggerated and plantar are extensor. And this is a radiological data set. And here sagittal, lateral view of the X-ray thoracic. And here what I want to show is there is widening of the neural foramen in this case, sir, involving the dorsal neural foramen. And here sagittal section in the T1 weighted images showing lesion present posterior to the cord and extradurally. And to say it's extradurally, there is a fat capping in the inferior pole, sir. These are axial sections, and in the coronal sections, we can see the lesion, and there is extension of lesion as daughter cysts into the neural foramen at 2 to 3 levels, sir. And these are through operative notes, sir. Through posterior midline approach, T8 to T12 laminectomy was done, and cyst mass was found dorsal to the dural sac with multiple extensions in intervertebral foramen. The cyst could be separated easily from the theca and completely removed. Intradural communication was seen at the T12 L1 level, which was excised and closed watertight. So these are the intraoperative pictures, sir, and we can see the cyst is present dorsal to the spinal cord, which was removed easily, and here the daughter cyst, which was completely removed from the neural foramen, sir. And here the bayonet forceps is pointing at the communication at the T12 L1 level, and it was closed watertight, sir. So post-operatively, and patient gradually power improved to 5/5, sir, and the HP report is suggestive of arachnoid cysts. And this is the case 2, and 43-year-old female presented with weakness of both upper limb and lower limb since 2 months, sir. Paresthesia both upper and lower limb since 2 months, and difficulty in walking since 1 week. There is no bladder and bowel disturbances. On examination, power was 4/4 in all limbs, and deep tenon reflex are exaggerated, plantar was bilateral extensor, and sensory system was normal. So these are radiological features, sir. In TY weighted images, they can see lesion present posterior to the cord at cervical level, sir. And in sagittal T1 weighted images, you can see here, to say it's an extradural, there is superior pole, there is a fat capping, sir. And these are axial sections of the same lesions, sir, compressing the spinal cord. And the patient was operated with midline posterior cervical incision. C3 to C6 laminectomy was done, sir. Cyst was found extradurally adherent to dura. Cyst separated and excised. Intradural communication was found at C4, C5 levels, and dural rent was closed. These are intraoperative pictures, sir. And here the dural rent was being closed, sir. And postoperative, patient power, initially there was a decrease in power, sir, immediate postoperative, but gradually improved to 4/5, sir. But on recent follow-up, the patient had persistent spasticity in all 4 limbs, sir, with power 4/5. This is a case 3, 47-year-old female presented with lower backache, radiating to left lower limb. Since 3 months, paresthesia left thigh, pain increasing on physical activity. Power was normal, sir, both lower limbs. Tenon reflex were exaggerated, sensory system was normal. These are again T1 weighted, T2 weighted sagittal section, sir. And here in the second picture, we can see there is scalloping of the vertebral body, which suggests of chronicity of the lesion present, sir. And these are T1 weighted images. On axial sections also, we can see this lesion present lateral to the cord and also causing scalloping of the vertebral body, which suggests of chronic compression, sir. And by intraoperative finding, by post-midline incision, D10 to D11 laminectomy was done. Posterior extradural cyst noted with extension into left neural foramen, separate from dural excised, and dural effect noted at L1 in suture and closed watertight, sir. These are intraoperative pictures, and post-operative was uneventful, and patient symptoms were relieved, sir. Then case 4, it's a 44-year-old female presented with weakness of right lower limb since 3 months, paresthesia both lower limbs, difficulty in walking. Patient is diagnosed case of pulmonary TB on ATT since 8 months, sir. And power was 4/5 on right lower limb and 4/5 in left lower limb, sir. Bilateral knee and ankle jacks were 3+, and Palantar's bilateral extensor sensitivity was normal. And here see in the T1 sections, we can see the lesion present anterior intradurally anterior to the cord, sir. And here clearly can be seen in the axial section, sir. Here the lesion is seen within the dura and anterior to the cord. So posterior midline incision was done, D9 to D11 laminectomy was done, dura was opened, arachnoid adhesions noted in this case, and well-defined cyst lesion noted anterior to the cord, cyst was opened and CSF was let out, and CSF was excised partially and marsupialization was done, sir, in this case. And post-operative patient gradually improved, sir, and power also improved to 5/5. And HP suggests of arachnoid cyst. Case 5, and 50-year-old female present with weakness of both lower limbs, one, sir, and no such sensory disturbances, no bladder or bowel disturbances. Tone was normal in both lower limbs. Power was 4/5 in both lower limbs. Deep and on reflexes were normal, sir. And here there is an intramedullary lesion seen, sir. And we got a contrast study and see non-enhancing lesion present in the dorsal cord, sir. These are the axial sections of the same lesion, sir, and coronal section, sir. So in this case, the midline posterior incision and D8 to D10 laminectomy was done, sir. Dura was opened by midline posterior mylotomy. Cyst entered and CSF was let out and cyst wall excised partially. Post-operative period was uneventful and patient gradually improved in both, power improved gradually in both lower limbs. And this is the tabulated form of same presentation of 7 cases, sir. And taking the age into perspective, and youngest patient is a 9-year-old and oldest is 64-year-old, sir. And all the patient improved gradually, sir. And 2 patients had persistent weakness, and 1 patient had complete paraplegia, sir. So gender in our series of 6 out of the 7 cases were females and plain. 5 cases were extradural, 1 intradural, 1 intradural extramedullary, and 1 intramedullary cyst. Location cervical, 1 is cervical, sir. 4 in thoracic in location, 2 in thoracolumbar junction, sir. Review of literature: spinal arachnoid cysts are rare. These cysts most commonly occur in the middle to lower thoracic spine of 65%, lumbar and lumbosacral 13%, lumbar thoracolumbar 12%, sacral 7%, cervical region 3%. And types of spinal arachnoid cysts, sir, can be extradural, intradural extramedullary, and intramedullary in location. And the classification 3 types, sir. Type 1 is extradural cyst without spinal nerve root fibers, and type 1A is extradural arachnoid cyst, and type 1B is sacral meningoceles. And type 2 is extradural cyst with spinal nerve root fibers, and type 3 is intradural cysts. So extradural arachnoid cysts, sir, they develop from protrusions of arachnoid herniation through a small dural defect. The junction of the dural sleeve of nerve root and thecal sac are the most common sites of these defects. Cysts have a pedicle in communication with the spinal arachnoid space, and etiology is congenital and acquired is through trauma, infection, or inflammation. There's a mechanism of pathogenesis, sir. Initially, expansion is due to the pressure differences between intrathecal CSF and epidural space, sir. And the Laplace law is the body of the cyst exerts a force on the neck sufficient to close the communication because its radius and wall tension are greater, and further enlargement with persistent CSF pulsations, and valve-like communicating through a mechanism called ball valve mechanism, sir. And radiology, MRI cysts are similar to those CSF signal intensity. Epidural fat capping of the lesion at its superior and inferior poles can be seen on T1 weighted image, MR images as of extradural location. The presence of vertebral body scalloping and expansion of the neural foramina bilaterally from osseous remodeling suggests long-standing mass effect from the lesion. Treatment: asymptomatic patient, conservative treatment. The observation is controversial. Treatment in patient with symptomatic neurological deterioration, complete excision of cyst, obliteration of the communicating pedicle, watertight repair of the dural defect to prevent the valve mechanism and to prevent the recurrence. Laminectomy in adults and nanoplasty is preferred in children to prevent kyphosis. In very large cyst extending several levels, small laminectomy and limited cyst wall fenestration with the aid of endoscope and closure of intradural communication. In a case of recurrence, cystoperitoneal shunt has been advised with success. So intradural extramedullary arachnoid cysts, sir, are even less common, and intradural they appear to result from an alteration of arachnoid trabeculae, and etiology is congenital, arachnoid adhesion secondary to inflammatory process, arachnoiditis due to bleeding, contrast agent, anesthetic, fibrin glue, and bone powder from previous surgeries, and traumatic and idiopathic causes. And treatment is complete excision and partial excision and fenestration if cyst is adherent or anterior to the cord. So intramedullary arachnoid cysts are even rare, very rare. Pathogens, presence of congenital arachnoid granulations in abnormal locations with prevalence at the thoracic level leading to cystic development. Treatment is fenestration with partial excision of cyst wall. Residue cyst wall can be sutured to a pyometer and ensure the connection of cyst cavity and subarachnoid space to prevent recurrence. And cysto-subarachnoid shunts advised in case of recurrence. Conclusion is, sir, surgical outcome is influenced adversely by duration of symptoms and increasing age of the patient. Sir. Best prognosis is seen when the surgery is done before the onset of neurological defects or duration. Sir. With occurrence of myelomalacia and cord atrophy, the prognosis is less satisfactory. These are the references taken from the literature, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, Dr. Premchand.
Yes, sir.
I have one question for you.
Yes, sir.
Generally, these kind of extradural cystic lesions you find in second or third decade or max fourth decade patients.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So considering that they are young patients and they have long segment involvements,
Yes, sir.
how do you know where is the communication? Means, is it that in every case you go on to do a long segment laminectomy?
No, sir. No, sir. So ideal to do is myelography, sir. CT myelography will define the location of the cyst, sir. That's how we can know the communication, and in that particular cases, we can do fenestration, and using endoscope, we can close the cyst wall, sir. I'm sorry, communication, sir.
Okay. Okay, fine. In a different paper, we can discuss about diagnostic modalities and their efficacies. Another question is, when a cystic lesion is situated anterior to the spinal cord, how
Yes, sir.
often have you had surprises? In the sense that haven't you included your enterogenous cyst in this paper, or you never encountered an enterogenous cyst? What is your take on that? Because one of your slides, which showed an anterior lesion to the spinal, a lesion anterior to the spinal cord,
Yes, sir.
very difficult to differentiate between an enterogenous cyst and an arachnoid cyst.
Yes, sir. In that, yes, sir, it is very difficult, sir. But what we thought in that particular case, sir, we are not expecting. I mean, like, I'm not very sure, sir.
Okay. Another question for you is, have you ever encountered recurrences in your cases or done elsewhere and you operated on a recurrent tumor? Any similar
No.
experience? Because enterogenous cysts located anterior to the cord are very notorious for their recurrences unless you chase them aggressively and remove every last bit, means whatever is possible at least.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Ramanmurthy sir, you would have
We have so far we haven't like noticed those cases, sir.
About to ask the same question, Dr. Suresh. Dr. Premchand, how many
Yes,
of
sir.
your cysts are reported as histopathologically as a neuroenteric cyst or androgynous cyst? Any one of these cysts are reported as neuroenteric cyst histopathologically?
No, sir.
Have you followed histopathology of all these cysts?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Any one is reported as histopathologically?
No, sir.
The mucin stain will show, Prussian blue stain will show your goblet cells, and mucus secretion will be very obvious on neuroenteric cysts. And neuroenteric cysts are notorious with, you can find a split in the vertebra and anteriorly located, and you may need to have a mediastinal CT scan or CT scan of the abdomen to see whether any communication with the primitive neuroenteric canal cysts. So I have presented the paper as a resident, senior resident in Nizam Institute of Medical Sciences way back in 1999. and urinary cysts. I made a class seminar also.
Okay,
But
sir.
they are notorious for recurrence. And patchy meningeal cysts is the second entity, which will project out like a extradural cyst, and they also have high recurrence rates. The recurrence in spinal cord cysts is very, very high, and it's disgusting actually. It is
Okay,
not truly a thing. You have shown a first video, it's excellent excision of the cyst. If that happens, most probably it's a parasitic cyst, most probably. You need to search aggressively the whole of the membrane histopathologically and find out a single small scolex sometimes. So you are blessed to have a cyst with defined margins and excision, like just take out a banana from the bunch. It's very rare. It's very rare in spinal cord cysts. Identifying the whole margins and removing it is very rare. It's very difficult.
Okay.
Thank
sir.
you.
Thank you, sir.
I must make a comment here that it is very difficult for any neurosurgeon to have as much pathological acumen as Dr. Raman Murthy has. He has an advantage of having a department of pathology and neuropathology, especially in his own home.
Yes, sir.
My regards to Dr. Vaidehi.
Thank you, Dr. Suresh. Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Varprasad, you can
Let's
introduce.
go on to the next paper. The next paper is intracranial tumors presenting as bony swelling of scalp, an institutional experience by Dr. Y. Srinivasa Rao, Andhra Medical College, Vizag. Is he ready?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Good morning, respected faculty members. I'm Dr. Srinivas Rao, neurosurgery postgraduate from Andhra Medical College, sir.
Please be loud.
Sir, am I audible now, sir?
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. A very
You are not shared your screen.
He's sharing, Suresh. So he's visible. Yeah, share your screen. Okay,
Yeah.
that's good. Put a slideshow.
yes, sir. Shall I proceed, sir?
Please.
Yeah, good.
Yes, sir. My study is about the bony swellings of the scalp, study of the bony swellings of the scalp and institutional experience under the guidance of Professor Dr. M.V. Vijaysekhar sir and Dr. K. Satyavara Prasad sir, Professor and HOD of the department, sir. Coming to the introduction, scalp is the soft tissue covering of the calvarium, and the swellings of the scalp, they cover an entire broad spectrum starting from congenital lesions like encephaloceles to benign lesions like osteomas, and also malignant pathologies like giant cell tumors, osteochondromas, other intracranial tumors such as meningiomas can also present as bony swellings of the scalp. My present study is on these swellings of the scalp which have a bony hard consistency. One condition which we take which need a special mention is that there are a few cases of intracranial tumors which on long standing they may present as bony lesions of the scalp, sometimes which may lead to a misdiagnosis, like this might be just a tumor which is arising from the calvarium, not from the underlying brain. So in our present study the results will be discussed further, sir. Coming to the introduction, coming to the anatomical extent of the scalp, it is extending from the supraorbital margins till the external occipital protuberance and superior nuchal lines. From lateral, it is extending from the zygoma and the mastoid process from one side to the other side. As we all know, the mnemonic SCALP scalp, the 5 anatomical layers of scalp are the skin, the subcutaneous tissue, the galea aponeurotica, the loose areolar tissue, and the periosteum. One thing which I would like to mention here, special mention about here is, there are a few cases in my study where a long-standing intracranial tumors, they have eroded the overlying calvarium and they have presented as bony swellings of the scalp. The lesions were subdivided by their location into 3 categories, sir. Their first lesions, this is actually a generalized classification of the lesions of the scalp. That is scalp swellings which are arising from the skin and connective tissue. Second classification is subgaleal lesions between the galea aponeurosis and the skull periosteum. And the third is the lesions that might include one or all the 3 layers of all the above layers of the scalp. These scalp swellings can be broadly organized into 4 categories. First is the pseudo lesions, lytic lesions, sclerotic lesions, and transdiploic lesions. The pseudo lesions include meningoencephaloceles and frontal hyperostosis, etc. The lytic lesions are like fibrous dysplasias, eosinophilic granulomas, aneurysmal bone cysts, giant cell tumors, metastasis. Sclerotic lesions of the bone include like osteomas, osteosarcomas, and metastasis. Transdiploic lesions are more commonly meningiomas and metastasis. Coming to our present study materials and methods, sir, this is an observational study which was conducted in the Department of Neurosurgery for a period of 2 years from October 2018 to October 2020, sir. The inclusion criteria of my study is all the patients who are presenting with a bony swelling of the scalp and the forehead region are included in the present study. Any patient who is presenting with a soft and a cystic swelling of the scalp were excluded from the study. Also, lesions like squamous cell carcinomas, basal cell carcinoma, malignant melanoma, which are restricted only to the skin or the subcutaneous tissue, they have been excluded from the studies. Coming to the results, in our study, a total of 16 cases were studied, in which males are 10 and females were 6. Sir. And the most common age group affected in this study was 6th to 7th decade of life. The most common lesion encountered out of the 16 cases is first meningioma, then followed by bone tumors, and then secondaries from other primary cancers. Apart from these three common lesions, one each case of eosinophilic granuloma, one malignant small round blue cell tumor, and a frontal fibrous dysplasia were noted in our studies. So this is the outcome of the study. A total of 7 meningiomas were identified. 4 cases of bone tumors, osteomas, giant cell tumors, etc. 2 cases are secondaries from unknown primaries which presented as bony lesions of the scalp, and one each of small round blue cell tumor, one eosinophilic granuloma, and fibrous dysplasia. This is a pie diagram which is showing that the most common lesion is meningioma, which is almost like near 50%. That is 7 out of 16 cases. Coming to the discussion part, sir, as already told, intracranial tumors, especially in long-standing cases, they may cause erosion of the overlying bone and can present as bony swellings on the head and forehead region. They might be confused with only lesions of the calvarium. That is, we may consider that this is just a tumor which is arising from the outer cortex of the bone or something. But one thing which we need to take into consideration is there is a remote possibility of an underlying brain tumor which can present as a skull bone swelling. Another thing is they can be arising from both primary calvarial bone tumors or secondaries from other primary tumors which can present as bony lesions of the scalp. So the presentation of intracranial tumors as swelling of the scalp is a very rare manifestation. So this study, we identify these cases and we evaluate the various parameters, like whether the swelling is due to the primary bone tumor or it is due to some other pathology like a primary osseous tumor of the overlying calvarium, or it is secondary from some other primary tumor. Coming to the meningiomas, as we know, it is the origin is from the araconite capsule. It is more common in females and the female-male ratio is 2:1. One thing which we need to know about meningiomas, which was given in the historical scriptures, is that meningiomas have left their mark in the form of hyperostosis on human skulls as far back as prehistoric times. These are the images of the patient who presented with a swelling over the right forehead and the right frontal region. The image findings which are showing a right frontal meningioma with a lesion which is projecting over the right forehead area, sir. Here we can see the lesion. These are the intraoperative images, and after the excision of the lesion, the histopathology report has come as meningothelial meningioma, sir. Coming to the next common lesion in our study, that is osteomas. Osteomas are the most common primary bone tumor of the calvarium. They're usually benign tumors. They are slow growing. They most commonly occur in the cranial vault. Apart from that, they also arise in the paranasal air sinuses, mastoid, also in the mandible. Osteomas are more common in female, and the highest incidence is seen in the 6th decade of life. This is the image which is showing a patient who presented with a swelling in the midline. He was around 68 years old, and this lesion was present for almost like 6 months before. This is a post-operative, a bicoronal incision, and reflection of the flap was taken, and complete excision of the tumor was done. This is the intraoperative image, and this is the post-operative specimen, which is showing a almost like 4 centimeter into 2.5 centimeter tumor. This is the post-operative image. We can see the bicoronal incision here. Coming to the third most common lesion identified in our study, that is cerebral metastasis. Metastasis from other primary sources are the third most common lesion. Here we present a patient who presented with a swelling in the right parieto-occipital area. This was bony in consistency. On examination, we could identify a lesion in his right lung, sir. This is the CT scan which is showing a lesion in the right parieto-occipital area and erosion of the underlying bone with a almost a huge swelling noted here, like 6 into 5 centimeter. This is the excised specimen, and histopathological examination of the same revealed adenocarcinomatous type of findings, sir. This is another case of secondaries in the skull from right-sided carcinoma of the breast. This patient was previously treated, as the image shows, a scar in the right chest area. She underwent a MRM in 6 months before. Later, she presented with a swelling in the right, same again, parieto-occipital area. This is the intraoperative image, which is showing a bony hard lesion, and excision of this specimen was done. This is the radiology image, which is showing a tumor also eroding the overlying bone. This is another case of secondaries in the skull. This patient had presented with a swelling in the midline forehead region for the last 4 months. She is a 68-year-old female. On examination, her thyroid was enlarged, sir. And on examination and further ultrasound neck as well as FNAC of the thyroid, it was diagnosed as follicular carcinoma of the thyroid. This is the CT image, which is showing a lesion in the midline projecting towards the right side, and we could see the lesion is eroding the bone of the calvarium. Coming to the lesion, frontal fibrous dysplasia, this child presented, this is a 6-year-old female child who presented with a slowly growing painless swelling over the forehead and over the vertex region. She, her milestones were completely normal, except for this cosmetic deformity. The child was absolutely normal. On imaging, we could see that the lesion is involving only the outer table of the skull. The brain was entirely normal. We had operated this case, and complete removal of the lesion was done. So this is a case of fibrous dysplasia. It is a non-neoplastic benign condition. The normal bone here is replaced by a fibrous connective tissue and immature woven bone, which is weaker than the normal bone. There are 3 forms of fibrous dysplasia. One is the cystic variety, sclerotic variety, and the mixed variety of fibrous dysplasia. This is another female who, she is a 34-year-old female patient who presented with swellings in right as well as left forehead region, sir. The history was around like 3 months. On radiological investigation, we could see the lesions present in both the right as well as left frontal region, with the bossing of the forehead seen in the right frontal. MRI image also shows corroborating findings. This is the intraoperative image where we could see both right as well as left lesions. Excision of the lesion was done, and histopathological examination has given the report as malignant small round blue cell tumor. This is another case of giant cell tumor. This patient presented with a swelling over the center as well as predominantly over the right side of the frontal as forehead region. This is the radiological investigation, which is showing the lesion in the right frontal area. Histopathological examination of the excised specimen has given the report as giant cell tumor. So these giant cell tumors are rare lesions that develop in the epiphyses of usually long bones, sir, but exceptionally they can also be present in the skull bones. In the skull, they're usually present in the sphenoid and the temporal bone. In our case, it presented usually in the frontal. In these cases, that is in the giant cell tumors which arise in the skull bones, they appear to be very aggressive in nature. This is a 3-year-old male child who presented with a painless swelling in the right frontal area, sir. Apart from the bony consistency, there was no other neurological deficit or no other significant mass lesion noted. This is the radiological investigation, which is showing the lesion only in the extradural plane. The brain was entirely normal. Intraoperative image, which shows the lesion osteolytic, it is a lytic lesion. The overlying bone was destroyed. The dura was completely normal. So the excised specimen was sent for histopathological examination, which was reported as eosinophilic granuloma. So eosinophilic granuloma, it is a rare, a benign tumor-like condition. It is the monoclonal proliferation of antigen-presenting mononuclear cells of dendritic origin, which are known as Langerhans cells. Eosinophilic granulomas can affect any bone in the skeleton, but they are more common in the flat bones like the skull bones, mandible, etc., and also spine. So concluding slide, sir, I would like to tell that bony lesions of the scalp have a wide spectrum ranging from benign conditions like meningiomas to malignant behaving lesions like eosinophilic granulomas to frankly malignant lesions like secondaries in the skull from other unknown primaries or known primaries. Other studies have also comparison with other studies. They have mentioned that the scalp lesions range from malformative encephaloceles, nasal gliomas, dermoid cysts, etc. But in this study, I have only included only bony swellings, sir. So the other studies, they usually included all consistencies, soft, firm, as well as bony swellings. This present study is only about bony consistency swellings. I would like to conclude and any further questions.
Thank you, Dr. Srinivas.
Thank you, sir.
I think you need to tailor your timing of your slides and the speed of your presentation. Thank you. It's a good effort.
We just have 3 more minutes, sir. So we'll have to make it fast.
Okay. Next presenter is Dr. JVNK Arvind. Experience with chronic subdural hematoma from Mamata Medical College Hospital, Khammam. Dr. JVNK Arvind is there?
Yes, sir. Available, sir.
Please go ahead. Thank you.
Yes, sir. The screen has to be closed, sir. The other Srinivas, Dr. Srinivas, can you
Srinivas,
please?
Yeah,
close the screen.
closing, sir. One second. Stop.
Okay. Slideshow, please.
Yes, sir.
You go ahead.
Okay.
So sorry, sir. The problem with the sharing screen, sir.
No problem. It's audible, it's visible and audible. You go ahead with that, like that only.
Okay, sir.
Scroll you have shared already, but go to the screen show, the cup icon. Okay. Start scrolling and start speaking.
Yes, sir.
Hello. Dr. Arvind? Dr. Arvind?
Yeah, Dr. Varaprasad, do we have any more speakers left?
Dr. Arvind?
Sir, is it visible, sir?
Yeah, it's very much visible. You go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. Good morning, everyone. Today my paper is on experience with the chronic subdural hematoma at retrospective review. My guides are being Dr. G. Malleswar Rao sir, HOD and professor, and Dr. K. Jagdish Babu sir, professor of neurosurgery, and Dr. A. Vimala madam, professor, associate professor in Department of Neurosurgery, Mamta sir. The chronic subdural hematoma is a liquefied hematoma in subdural space. It has a characteristic outer membrane, and if known, at least 3 weeks after the head injury. Most commonly, the patients with craniocerebral disproportion present with chronic subdural hematomas, and in some cases, there might be a minor trauma sharing in the dural border cell, which causes the injury to the cortical veins bridging to the dura, and where the walls are thinnest, the passing through the dural border cell layer. The pathogenesis include a layer of granulation tissue adjacent to the dura, followed by inflammation and angiogenesis of the same, and followed by initially clots, later fibrinolysis and hemolysis occur, and enclosed chronic subdural hematoma cavity prevents clearance of fibrolytic enzymes, inflammatory cytokines, and angiogenic factors. This leads to cycles of inflammation, fibrinolysis, angiogenesis, and rebleeding. Etiology. The main etiology include age, alcohol, more common in male patients when compared to the females, patients who are on anticoagulants or antiplatelets, and in old age people where there is a brain atrophy is very common. And other causes include the post ventriculoperitoneal shunts, low ICP or lumbar CSF drainage or spontaneous intracerebral hemorrhage, spinal anesthesia, and spinal surgery where it presents with a dural tear. Radiology. Routinely CT scan is done. It has been suggested chronic subdural hematomas hypodense at the very early stage and isodense in case of mature stage and mixed density in progressive stage and low density in the resolving phase. Homogeneous hypodense, isodense or hyperdense hematoma risk is 10 to 15%. In case of laminar thin high density layers usually along the inner membrane, high risk of enlargement. And layered or separated or gradation, two components of different density, that is low density anteriorly and high density posteriorly. If margin is distinct, separated subtype, and if margin is indistinct, gradation type, and high risk of growth and recurrence. And management options include both medical and surgical, and in my paper we considered the surgical option, both burr-hole craniotomy or conventional or mini craniotomy. So craniotomy of versus burr-holes, which procedure, which outcome, mortality and morbidity, which is better, complications and recurrence. So materials and methods include a design of retrospective study, and audit was operated at Mamta Super Specialty Hospital, Khammam, for operated cases of chronic subdural hematoma. 20 cases, outpatient and casualty admissions were taken, CT diagnosis were considered, 2 burr-holes for burr-hole tapping, frontal and parietal, and for decompressive craniotomy, it is FTP decompressive craniotomy. Materials and methods inclusion criteria include the patients of all age groups who underwent surgery for chronic subdural hematoma and CT diagnosis. Follow-up subsequent OP visit, emergency visit to casualty, or repeat CT within 1 week of surgery, and follow-up CT only if clinical. So results include, it's more common in males. 80% of my study showed males more than females. And age group, usually mean age group is 81. More commonly seen in patients with 75 to 85 years age group, sir. And past history or comorbidities, in case of diabetes 11/20 and hypertension 10/20, alcoholics around 12/20 and smokers 7/20. And history of antiplatelets and anticoagulants 5 people, bleeding thiasis is seen in 5 to 20, and chronic renal failure 1 patient. Results presenting symptoms. Most of the patients presented with altered sensorium or decreased cognition. In my study, it is around 45%, and headache is present in 35%. Altered gait is present in 30%. Vomitings are present in 30%. and seizures are present in 15% and trauma in 20%. So GCS on admission, most of the individuals presented with GCS of around 13 to 15, amounting to 40%, and 35% presented with 9 to 12 of GCS, and less than 8 presented with 25% of GCS. Management, out of the 20 patients, burr-hole tapping was done for 13 patients and craniotomy was done for 7 patients, amounting to 35%. So out of 13 patients who underwent burr-hole tapping, 9 patients discharged and 2 patients expired and 2 patients had recurrence, and resurgery was done in 2 patients. And out of 7 patients, 2 patients expired. Out of 7 patients who underwent craniotomy, 2 patients expired, 5 patients discharged and no recurrence. Complications, most of the time, dyselectrolemia is the most common complication, either of the thing, burr-hole or craniotomy, and wound infections, and CSF leaks, seizures are the most complications. Discussion, chronic subdural hematoma remains to be Chronic subdural hematoma remains to be one of the commonly encountered neurosurgical problems. Management decision is based on nature of hematoma and patient's general condition. Both burr-hole tapping and craniotomy have satisfactory outcomes. And defined recurrence is defined in case of my study like return of symptoms within some time after surgery, without expansion of chronic SDH or with expansion of residual postoperative chronic SDH. And burr-hole tapping had a higher rate of recurrence, 15% versus craniotomy 0% at the end of 1 month follow-up. Mortality, the craniotomy group had higher overall mortality of 29% versus 16% for burr-hole group, and deaths primarily are due to the pulmonary and renal complications, enormous physiological stress, longer operative times, and advanced age. There is a case discussion of a 3-year-old male child with history of irritability, drowsiness, admitted with GCS of E2, V3, M5, and pupils are bilaterally reactive. History of trauma is present, and routine lab is seen normal, and CT is suggestive of chronic SDH, isodense collection with midline shift. Burr-hole tapping is done, and patient improved and discharged on postoperative day 8. And there's one more case discussion. Patient returned casualty after 1 month, E2, V2, M4 with the GCS, and 2 episodes of seizure. CT showed recurrent acute on chronic SDH, and with lab values of PT-INR raised and APTT greater than 75 seconds. Multiple FFPs and PRBC transfusions are given. FTP craniotomy showed recovered despite active bleeding collections, and later referred to the hematologist. Conclusion, it doesn't matter how good your bullets are if you don't aim carefully. Conclusion, both have their own place and importance, that is both burr-hole tapping and decompressive craniotomy. Deciding between the two is difficult and mainly decided by the image-guided and patient-guided approach. Consider primary bleeding disorders in pediatric age group despite history of trauma. Craniotomy is the act of good clearance, but burr-holes are act of perseverance. Thank you.
Doctor,
Sir.
You told at one point of during your presentation decompressive craniectomy. Did you do decompressive craniectomy for chronic subdural?
Sir, decompressive craniotomy, sir, if it is big enough, and we did in 7 patients, sir.
Why? What is the reason for decompressive craniotomy?
Sir, actually, initially 2 cases where the burr-holes were placed, patient.
No. I mean, was there any brain bulge during the surgery? Why did you remove the bone flap?
Sir, actually, they presented along with a chronic subdural hematoma, sir.
No, I think you are confusing. You did decompression by craniotomy, or you did a decompressive craniotomy?
Decompression by craniotomy, sir.
You said decompressive craniotomy. So decompressive craniotomy means removing a bone flap.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So you shouldn't confuse.
Yes, sir.
You got confused.
Sorry.
Doctor, do you put drain regularly?
Depending upon the hemostasis we achieve, sir, if there is any dural rupture or something, we usually put a drain, sir. In case of decompressive craniotomy and decompression for craniotomy.
Dural rupture. What do you mean by dural rupture?
In a
No, it is a subdural. You have subdural. What sir is asking is how many cases you have used or what is your experience with using a subdural drain after draining, after evacuating chronic subdural hematoma?
in burhole evacuations only. In
In
burhole,
we never put a drain, sir, in burhole.
no, in burhole evacuations, if you put a drain, the post-operatively the patient having headaches and drowsiness will be very, very less. Drain is really definitely advisable.
Okay, sir.
It is advisable actually if you put two burholes through the
Yes.
dependent burhole, you have to you can keep a drain depending on when, and that too when you suspect some thing, some recollection, and more so in burhole category.
If you put a drain, patients have less headaches and a smoother post-operative recovery.
Okay, sir.
Varaprasad,
Sir,
my presentation is ready, but I don't think time is not there.
yeah, the presentation in hall 3 has already started.
Okay. Thank you. We conclude
Thank
this.
you.